I would be embarrassed to tell you the number of times in any given week that I actually have the courage and strength to make it through an entire news program or an entire podcast. I lasted about 5 minutes listening to the New York Times daily podcast this past Thursday. It was about nursing homes. The show was about how instead of caring for our elders with dementia, Alzheimer's, doctors are conspiring with staff to diagnose them with schizophrenia so that they can then be given psychotropic drugs that will make them compliant. Not cared for, but compliant. When the host asked the reporter whether this was a sign of failing nursing homes or the collapse of an entire system designed to care for our elders, I reached a very familiar point in my engagement with the world. It's called despair. I hope you'll indulge my emotion this morning. Maybe take this time to indulge in some despair with me, just like the ancient Israelites did in their Psalms of Lament. Is everything falling apart? What is working in America right now, let alone the world? We have a member here, Chris Bradshaw, whose doctors knew before the pandemic that he needed surgery on his neck. Chris is in intolerable pain. But because of not only COVID itself, but the COVID deniers and the anti-vaxxers crowding up the hospitals, Chris has remained in pain with no surgery scheduled, 2 years on. And one of the reasons Chris and other sufferers cannot easily get the pain medication that they so obviously need is that for decades, the pharmaceutical companies and the doctors who effectively worked for them were in the business of creating addicts. So in the backlash, those who really need opioids can't get them. Indulge my despair just a little bit longer because I haven't even scratched the surface. I love more than anything to swim. I will jump in any body of water. Honestly, I've jumped in some bodies of water that I should not have jumped in. One that led to Niagara Falls comes to mind. It is my ultimate joy, though. A few years ago, a friend and I planned a trip to the Russian River, and I was so excited. And then just a few months ago, I planned a trip for my family to Big Bear Lake, and I was so excited. And then both times when I arrived, I found that the water had been contaminated by what's called blue-green algae blooms, which are happening all over the United States. People and pets can die from this if the water is ingested. The conditions for the algae are provided by chemicals used in agricultural industry, which make their way into the watershed. But the blooming occurs with dangerous frequency and density as a result of rising temperatures. These little blooms are like tiny lethal messengers sent to us from the 19th century, reminding humanity that there is no exploitation of nature that does not have its consequences. Swimming is such a simple thing, such a natural thing, just like offered up to us by God in the creation of bodies of water. But now I and other humans refrain from diving into the water. And meanwhile, polar bears in the Arctic have no choice as their ice melts. The Great Barrier Reef, that vibrant, like supermarket of the deep, looks like a ghostly morgue. Do I have to even list the evidence that our democracy is in great peril? Our systems are broken. Our wisdom has failed us. It has been short-sighted, it has been self-serving, it has been prideful, it has not been wisdom. Or as James puts it in the passage that Judy just read, it has only been the wisdom of the world. Writing to the early Christian churches, James identifies the selfish, ambitious behavior he sees in those early churches and calls that the wisdom of the world. He asks those he is writing to instead embrace the opposite, the wisdom from above. Where there is envy and selfish ambition, James writes, there will also be disorder and wickedness of every kind. Amen. The short-sighted wisdom of the world has consequences, disorder of every kind. What could be more disordered than the sick not being able to get the help they need in the richest country in the world? What could be more disordered than an orangutan who asks for very little in this world, clinging to the single solitary tree left over in his home, because we who have everything must also have the palm oil that gives our beauty products a long shelf life? James continues, but the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without a trace of partiality or hypocrisy. James was so ridiculously right. The heavenly wisdom he describes is not the wisdom of the world. And yet it is the wisdom of the world that we have given our confidence to. We have not followed the spiritual wisdom that would lead to order, peace, and fruitfulness. If we take just one attribute of the wisdom from above, willingness to yield, if we just take that one attribute, we see how countercultural it is to the systems that dominate our lives. Ambition, selfishness, mastery have propped up the exploitive economic and political systems that have destroyed our environment, corrupted our ideas of equality and justice, polarized our country, and made it nearly impossible for us, in some cases, to talk even to people who are different from us. I understand that, as did James. I understand that the wisdom of the world has destroyed the world. But here's where I, and maybe you, sometimes get stuck. Because what I don't understand, James, what I don't understand, Jesus, is how my willingness to yield solves all those big problems. How can my willingness to yield lead to justice and reconciliation? Yielding sounds to me like giving up. And when I hear about animals going extinct and water being polluted and black men being abused by police, I want to fight. I want to dig in and say, no, you are wrong and I am right, and this is what's going to happen from here. How can we yield when there are destructive forces we must stop? How can we yield when there is evil that we must exert our control over? There was a time in my life, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, when it seemed like every Christian that I knew or respected was reading and quoting from a Buddhist nun named Pema Chodron. So I picked up her book. It's called When Things Fall Apart, Heart Advice for Difficult Times. It drew me in immediately. It had insight that I so clearly needed. And it also infuriated me My children seem to be saying that the way to change the world was to yield, to observe, and to not attach myself to outcomes. I came to that book, and we come to the teachings of James and Jesus as immigrants from the wisdom of the world, where exerting control and asserting right and having ambition are the wise things to do. I came to Pema Chodron's Buddhism. We come to the Bible's wisdom, and we feel like immigrants to a new land, where a new language is spoken and strange customs are observed. Yield to find peace, be gentle to be fruitful, says James. Blessed are the meek, says Jesus. We don't set out to save the world, says Pema Chodron. We set out to wonder how other people are doing and to reflect on how our actions affect other people's hearts. To find peace, we have to better understand what it really means to yield. Yielding does not mean giving up power. It is not the same as the earthly term submission, even though that word is used in the Bible. In submission, there is coercive power. You cannot not submit. In yielding, though, there's choice. Yielding results when someone with agency makes a decision based on God's persuasive power in any given moment. Our decision to yield has everything to do with our ability to discern the difference between earthly power, which is corruptible, wild, and aggressive, and God's power, which is pure, peaceable, and just. Without that distinction in our hearts, we cannot yield. With that distinction, we can make a choice that will save our lives and change the world. Finally, yielding is not passive or weak. It is not giving up. I've really struggled with that notion because I, like many people, maybe even some in this room, like to have control. And more than that, more than even wanting to have control, I fear what will happen if I don't have control. Who will step into that power vacuum if I give it up? Can I really trust God to do it better? Thank you for laughing. Let's stop for a moment and appreciate the obvious absurdity of that question. Can God really do it better? What a silly question. But also, please, let's appreciate how many times implicitly we ask that question. We may ask it today. We may have already asked it today. Every time we refuse to give up control over a mess we individually or we as humans have made, every time we refuse to give up our control, we are asserting, in fact, that God might not be able to do it better than we have done. When we seek control, we are doubting God's ability to do it better. It's an absolutely absurd notion and a real fear we act on daily. I resolved this fear for myself, at least in a logical sense, through an analogy. So I'm a writer, right? I have identified that way since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. I'm a writer. So I asked myself one day, I don't know what the situation was, Julie, could Shakespeare write this better than you? Yes. Yes, Julie, Shakespeare is definitely a better writer than you are. Okay. Then I said to myself, is Shakespeare a human? Yes. Yes, Julie, Shakespeare is a human. And so finally I said to myself, Julie, if you can agree that Shakespeare, a human, is a better writer than you ought to be able to accept that God, being divine, is a better writer than you. And I found that I could admit that God is a better writer than me. So then if I can agree that there are humans who are more capable than I am, and if I have even a limited understanding of what it means to be divine, I can easily agree that God can do it better than humans. To yield to God is nothing more than referring the problem to someone better equipped to deal with it. Yielding to God, to peace, to gentleness, in the face of conflict, and in the face of despair, no matter how big or immediate the problem, is not about being weak or giving up. Yielding to God is not about being passive. It's about letting something more powerful pass through us. Amen.